The Economic Community of West African States has said there are no urgent plans to carry out a military action in Niger. They insist on using diplomatic means to quell the tensions rising from the coup. Now, after threats and deadlines, it seems like dialogue is the way forward. Well, no one wants the war, but the Ecowas bloc is mounting pressure for a return to democracy with the hopes of bringing calm in the region. Nigeria will be a major player if anything happens, but Nigeria is faced with challenges of insecurity internally as well. Just recently, some personnel were slain during an ambush by terrorists. The military has vowed to avenge the death. I'll be speaking with top defense and security experts about the mounting tensions in the Ecowas region and Nigeria's own internal issues. I'm Sulaiman Alede, and this is Arise Prime Time. West African regional body Ecowas says that there are no immediate plans to carry out military action in Niger Republic, insisting using diplomatic means to address the issues arising from the coup in the country was still on the table. Omar Toure, president of the Ecowas Commission, made this and other submissions while addressing the cross-section of the media at the Commission's secretariat here in Abuja on developments in Niger since the coup and efforts to restore democracy in the country. The Ecowas Commission says coup d'etat is a tragedy for regional efforts at consolidating democracy. This factor has made it imperative to decide that in Niger Republic was one coup too many, and the Ecowas president says planning an all-out war against a member nation has been ruled out at the moment.
Yes. ECOWAS has neither declared war on the people of Niger, nor is there a plan, as it is being purported, to invade the country. The ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government has only activated a full-scale application of sanctions, which include the use of legitimate force to restore constitutional order. In the interim, the region is employing other elements of its instruments and engaging with the military authorities, as can be attested to by the several missions that have been fielded to the country and our joint efforts with our partners, including the African Union and the United Nations. We are hopeful that these diplomatic efforts will yield the desired outcome and make it unnecessary for the deployment of the force. Nonetheless, preparations continue towards making the force ready for deployment. Consequently, the technical arms of the decision-making organs, which include the Committee of Chiefs of Defense Staff, have also been directed to prepare the community enforcement mechanism in case it becomes compelling to deploy the force. Friends of the press, we believe that even now it is not too late for the military authorities in Niger to reconsider their action and listen to the voice of reason, as the regional leaders will not condone coup d'etat. ECOWAS also wishes to remind them of their responsibility for the security and safety of President Bazoum, members of his family, and government.
Well, let's have an expansive conversation on security. My guests tonight, two top-notch security experts with global experience in the field. Joining me tonight live is the international security analyst who is a certified anti-terrorism specialist and is the African representative of the Global Anti-Terrorism Accreditation Board, David Otto. Also, the security expert and retired U.S. Army Captain Bish Johnson. Gentlemen, good to see you both, and thanks for your time. This is all about Africa, and Africa is thankful to having both of you here to talk about this. Now, let's start by establishing this. First, let's start from home. It's very unfortunate that we have fallen heroes, and the funeral had just happened, and quite a sad one. But when we come back we'll talk more about how it went down. Yeah. If our hearts to the families and members of the Nigerian military on that. But what's happening now about ECOWAS? Both of you, we've had that conversation here before, and first we thought it was going to be an all-out trouble, and for everyone, they've been on the same page. This is not the time for us to go on any war. It will amount to us fighting ourselves. But listening to the ECOWAS president, let's start with you, Captain Bish. What do you make of that? Because it looks as if there's some form of logic and reasoning in the whole dialogue process.
Let me tell you, none of such situations have ever been resolved by military actions. Military action can only guarantee you maybe 20% of the solution, but 80% or more of the solution to situations like that is resolved on, through dialogue and diplomatic means. That has been my position from day one. That has been the position of so many experts. What has happened with ECOWAS is that they make that hasty decision of giving a deadline without actually considering the external factors, because they had looked at Niger Republic as one small country, and so they didn't consider other external factors. And this is because they have failed to learn from history. Barack Obama drew a line in the sand in Syria that if chemical weapon is ever used, that would be a red line for him. Chemical weapon was eventually used in Syria that led to hundreds of deaths. Barack Obama failed to act because he didn't also consider other external factors such as the presence of Russia. Russia has made similar mistake in Ukraine when it invaded Ukraine without considering the unity and support of Russia and US and its Western allies. So a mission that ought to have taken a couple of days in their estimation they're now bogged down. They're now into what is called mission creep, right? You go into a mission with the intention to accomplish your objective within a couple of hours or days.
That you think you just go in and come out.
And you go there and you get stuck. Because when you get in there, you discover that you're going to have to, instead of going in there to achieve objective A, you're going to have to discover that you have to now do objective B, C, D, E before you can actually get to that objective A. That is what happened to Russia in Ukraine. That's even what happened to the US in Iraq as well. The United States made the same mistake too. They went into Iraq to decapitate the Saddam Hussein administration, and America get bogged down in Iraq, went from decapitating the administration of Saddam Hussein to nation building. Okay, that took several years and hundreds of billions of dollars. I have said it that, look, the goal shouldn't even be to restore Mohamed Bazoum, because that is never going to happen again. Any attempt to try to restore him is flawed with a lot of risk, because the military junta that is holding him hostage is not going to sit there watching him while you come to rescue him. The man may lose his life by any attempt by ECOWAS to try to rescue him. So it's too dangerous. The best approach is what they have decided to do now, because I think ECOWAS leadership now listen to majority of Africans, saying that, look, you don't go into war in Niger, you're going to have Africans shooting at Africans. And when Africans shoot at Africans, guess who is going to be the casualty? It's Africans that are going to be the casualty, whether they are soldiers or they are civilians. So I think they're listening to broad majority of Africans. They are now going through the way of diplomacy and political solution, which is what most Africans have advocated for.
Let me bring in David here. David, I caught you for a few times, nodding while Bish was talking. And some of the key concerns, he's used the word external factors. And I also recall you had also spoken about that. But quickly here, let's look at those, because there's this threat in Nigeria, especially around the stretch of that state. Seven states. We're not talking about 2, 3, 4, 7 states, and we're talking about the monies that have been lost owing to the little border closure or sanction against Niger. What does this say of us quickly here, of trying to understand the situation? Because the people are in those areas trying to understand it, and even war veterans are also trying to sound their alarm, telling politicians and policy makers that this is a no-go area.
You can't win any war, unfortunately, without the buy-in of the people. And as you likely said, we're not just talking about the 7 states which shares borders with Niger, which are quite critical because, of course, this is not just sharing border, but, these are people that share the same culture, religion, and kin. Go to the position of Niger. Niger itself, we do recognize, and I'm sure that, I do agree with my colleague that Ecowas has listened to the voice of reason, but also to the voice of sustainability in terms of, how are they going to achieve their mission. The people of Niger seem, as we've seen since the 26th of July when this coup happened, they seem to be much behind the coup leaders. And we've also seen the fact that Ecowas has been able to push the Nigerian to the point where they have now created an alliance with Burkina Faso and Mali and other countries like Guinea. Countries like Algeria, are also who share borders with Niger Republic are also not very keen on a military intervention. So I am very relieved that Omar Toure, who is the commission head, made these statements today to clarify, although he was quite ambiguous in terms of what he was trying to say, because of course he said ECOWAS is not planning an invasion. Of course, if you carry out a military intervention, then effectively you are invading a country. Even if you have the UN Security Charter, Article 2.4, you're still invading. But of course, the UN hasn't given any authorization, nor has there been any element of defense from a Nigerian perspective. So I think it's quite critical that ECOWAS has backtracked on this issue of a military intervention. There is no guarantee, as my colleague said, that they would achieve their success. I'm afraid, just like him, that President Bazoum might not, be able to be restored. But I could see that in the language of the Commission's president. They are talking now on the basis of restoring democracy. They're talking on the basis of releasing President Bazoum, his family, and some government officials. So that idea of reinstating President Bazoum is dead in the waters. So I think what is important at this point in time is that Africa has been able to, free itself from that temptation of being led by perhaps external parties. I've made it very clear that any war that will be launched by ECOWAS countries do not manufacture weapons. They would have to get that from outside, perhaps from Western or Eastern states, and that will come, at a very high price. And even so, that still does not guarantee that we would have any kind of success in that, because we will be creating some coalitions. I listened to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He was speaking at the BRICS summit in South Africa. He made it very clear that there are some establishments of a counterforce, and that was solidified when we saw Niger having signed some kind of an alliance with Burkina Faso and Mali, that in the event of any ECOWAS intervention, they would also be part of that war. So we are not in a good place, and I'm glad that ECOWAS Commission has, given us some assurance that peace is the way forward.
Let me jump in there, because now you're talking about ECOWAS, and there's AU. That's your bigger umbrella body. The African Union has just actually placed sanctions on Niger. Keep in mind, there is also crisis in the Sudan, sure. Which the East African bloc hasn't been able to help mediate. And ECOWAS has also been absent in that war. So how does ECOWAS understand the crisis on the continent, knowing full well that we just had brothers take up arms against each other in Ethiopia and the Tigrayans, and now we have the Sudanese also doing the same. Can we afford another one?
In fact, one war is too many wars to have on this continent. There's been more bloodshed on African continent as a result of war than diseases, hunger, all of them put together. So starting a new war is not going to be of any benefit to anyone on the continent. I think we should be doing more to wind down and and end the ones that are already raging. So we can't start a new one. Now coming back to Niger, I am happy that ECOWAS is listening, but I think ECOWAS need to do more to understudy the crisis in the Sahel. If you look at all the countries in the Sahel that had staged coup within the last few years, they're mostly Francophone Africans. And so there's a common denominator there. And that common denominator is that these people were previously colonized by the French. And the French still remain very prevalent in those countries and dominate every aspect of their lives in the form of a new colonialism. And the people are beginning to, stand up to the old colonial masters and to, unwind them and to liberate themselves from both political and economic colonialism that are going on in those countries. So I think ECOWAS will do itself a favor, and it will be more successful in the future if it takes in-depth look into the remote causes of these military coup d'etats that we have experienced, particularly in the Sahel.
I'm not cutting you off.
Sure.
Put this into perspective.
Yes.
As ECOWAS is trying to understand that, does it seem to you as if the AU is fanning the embers? Because with AU jumping in now, with the sanction, one would have thought that as ECOWAS is trying to understand what we're all discussing and what Africa is talking about, they seem to be clapping and say, no, go all out with the sanction.
It's the same leaders. The same leadership in ECOWAS is the same leadership that constitutes the AU. So all of them have the same mindset. Understand that the AU, as far as I'm concerned, AU does not even have the moral authority to say that there shouldn't be coup in Africa. You see, democracy is a good system of government, the best system of government. We all acknowledge that. And who wouldn't? A government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Who wouldn't want that? But in reality in Africa, is democracy actually a government of the people? Is it actually a government by the people? And is it actually a government for the people? You see, until you address the fundamentals of democracy and put the fundamentals of democracy in place in Africa, you're going to continue to have coup d'etats. Until you have an independent judiciary, until you have a free, fair, credible election across Africa in which the will of the people is not subverted, you're going to have coup d'etat. Until you end sit-tight leadership. Since I was born, I have never heard of any other president in Cameroon other than Paul Biya. Now, when you have sit-tight presidents who sometimes they will alter their constitution to be able to elongate themselves in power, you're going to have coup d'etat. So I think ECOWAS need to spend more time, AU in particular, need to spend more time addressing some of these problems with their own members. Biya attends AU summit, and so are all the other sit-tight presidents. They have not condemned them, right? They have not condemned them for altering their constitutions and elongating themselves in power. Now, any day the military strikes, AU will now come out and say, look, there should be no coup. But you've seen the reasons, the things that will lead to coup all in place, and you do nothing. So as far as I'm concerned, AU is a do-nothing organization. They have never been able to achieve anything since their inception, whether it's economic or political. You would think that there would be a national rail system running across the whole of Africa, courtesy of the AU. It doesn't happen.
But I think I do agree with you.
Let's let David comment.
No,
go ahead, David.
I think I agree with you because AU talks about silencing the guns, Agenda 2030, 2063. Yet we have a crisis that is looming. Has been in Ethiopia. That is the capital of AU. Addis Ababa, of course. We have the Tigray crisis. Again, as you mentioned, other crises in the continent. The ECOWAS, which is supposed to be the first to go to, for example, when there's a regional crisis, talks about that it has, the Lomé Protocol, which demands that Article 25 would allow ECOWAS to intervene in an event of any attempted coup or a military coup that overthrows a democratic elected government. But ECOWAS was very silent. when we had the same military coup in countries like Mali, Guinea,
Burkina
and
Faso.
Burkina Faso. So the question that ECOWAS must answer is, why do you decide at this point in time that you want to apply Article 25 of the Lomé Protocol to Niger? But also, what about the timing of applying that Article 25? I mean, in reference to the point that Omar Toure, who is the president of the Commission, made mention of the fact that ECOWAS has a legal backing to go into Niger, from a military perspective. So I think there is a lot.
Does size matter?
Size doesn't matter in 21st century warfare.
because one would have thought that perhaps they ignored all others and said, hey, wait a minute.
Yes.
Niger, small Niger. Let's stop them.
I think that would be perhaps one of the reasons why Niger sees this as a challenge and, would probably not want to comply with some of the ECOWAS sanctions. But also, if you look at the application of the sanctions, usually in diplomacy, you apply sanctions in tranches, so steps, simple, complex, and more complex sanctions. But what we had in the case of ECOWAS v. Niger Republic was a situation where ECOWAS did apply sanctions. It applied diplomatic pressure. At the same time, it gave them a 7-day ultimatum. That should not have happened. And that accounts for the reason why ECOWAS at this point in time has to backtrack and talk about the difference between invasion and military intervention. When a body of that nature has to come back to explain to journalists, what it had said in the past, it therefore means, there was a critical mistake in terms of, how it presented the case. So what we have now is a situation where we are encouraging all parties, to shield their swords. ECOWAS must be able to understand at this point in time that there is no appetite, neither in Nigeria, nor in the region, nor in Niger, for any war to happen in that region. We've seen a high level of preparation being made in Niger in the event of a military intervention. So I think at this point in time, as my colleague said, Africa should, put pressure on all parties.
Before I come back to Bish, I wanted to weigh in on one of the key issues he raised, and it has to do with the reasons behind these coups. And he's talked about governance, which is very instructive here, how some of those, under the guise of democracy, have also gone on some kind of democratic coup d'etat against the people, making them think that they... So speak to us on that, because there must be a first cause, something to activate for you to see what we're dealing with at the moment. And he thinks it's about that pseudo-democracy in most of these countries.
And I think he's perfectly right. We've looked at the reasons why coup d'etats succeed and the reasons why they fail. And what we found is that one of the key reasons why the recent coup d'etats, if you talk about in the Sahel, have failed, is because of what democracy stands for. As my colleague rightly mentioned, there is no independence of the legislature, the executive, or the judiciary. The government does not represent the voice of the people. Africa has a 75 youthful population, but when you look at the percentage of the youth that are represented in government, it's less than 20%. So you find out that the key element that has led to so many of these coups is that the democracy that is practiced in Africa has the element of the military being used for regime protection rather than national security protection. In the Western world, you don't have the military too close to power. I mean, look at the case of Nigeria, for example. After several military coups, what the Nigerian government has been able to do is to have a security architecture that is close to power but unable to take power. The one that is able to take power is not close to power. And these are the kind of elements which ECOWAS must be able to look into. Look at, for example, the element of rapidity. Now, most of the military coups do succeed because, of course, they take power, they kind of take the president hostage. They make sure that they suspend the constitution, they dissolve parliament, they suspend members of government. Within that space of 24 hours, this is when ECOWAS should have intervened using a standby force. But ECOWAS did not have a standby force. ECOWAS has talked about having a standby force. They didn't have one. So ECOWAS has itself to blame. If it had intervened within 24 hours of the military coup in Niger, we will not be where we are.
No standby force, no money to push this. And of course, we're coming home because pretty much later we'll come back. We'll talk more about what this means if all else fails and what it means in the fight against insurgency, banditry, and what Nigeria is dealing with, and if this will also ultimately affect its partners, with Niger being top on the list. We'll be back shortly. Plenty more still ahead. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we have perspectives on the news and talking points of the day with me, Sulaiman Aleda. We're talking about security around Nigeria and the subcontinent, and that's why we're taking the entire show to talk more about this. We're still talking insecurity tonight. Now let's, and I still have my guest with me. But again, quickly here, you did say that one of the key reasons of coup d'etats on the continent is because of the kind of democracy we practice. Now, if it's not right, let's give a sense of what's right. What kind of government, what kind of democracy do you think should help Africa get out of this?
Look, government or governance is about the people, whether it's democracy or it's military. Whichever one that is taking care of the people is the one that the people will recognize. Now, yes, we all want democracy because it offers more people the opportunity to participate in government, right? But not the type of democracy that we're practicing right here in Africa. If we want coup to end in Africa, we have to practice the type of democracy that is practiced in the Western world. Real democracy. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In practice. Not in principle, not on paper. You see what is happening in the US right now. A district attorney, county attorney, for those who don't know what county is a local government. And coincidentally, that is my own local government in the US.
Fulton County.
Fulton County. That's where you have Atlanta. That's where my family is. A local government attorney, district attorney, is who indicted a former president. Gave him 2 weeks to surrender himself. Failure to do so, an arrest warrant would have been issued to go and find Donald Trump anywhere he is and get him arrested.
And he flew all the way down.
And bring him to Fulton County. The president knew the implication of what would have happened. That's why he came. He was booked, fingerprinted, a mugshot of him taken. That is democracy. Until we can attain that level of democracy in Africa, we won't see an end to coup d'etat. And that is the problem. And if the West are really interested in helping Africa, they should help Africa to achieve the type of democracy that they have in their place, where if their leaders break the law, they go to prison for it. You saw it happen in Italy. You saw it happen in France, Sarkozy. You saw it with Berlusconi. You know, until we can get to that point where we can hold our leaders to account, you're not going to have a situation where there is no military intervention. Because those fundamentals of democracy must be put in place. And so the West is doing lip service and doing us a disservice by saying that, look, you know, they know very well that democracy that we are practicing in Africa is nothing but sham. But because it's, you know, it supports their interests. That is why they are helping our leaders to perpetuate those type of democracy that do not benefit the people, but instead benefits them. So if they're serious about helping us, they should help us to achieve their own type of democracy, where a local government or district attorney can indict a former president, book him, fingerprint him, and take a mock shot of him.
Let me bring in David Otto to weigh in on this, because the whole essence of this conversation is to get to the root of coups so that we understand what we're dealing with. And listening to Captain Bish here says a lot. A local government can actually work and help us get what Nigeria has called the dividend of democracy.
And that's where we talk about the independence of the judiciary, the executive, and the legislation. That's an example. Of course, the US has its own challenges, when it comes to democracy. When President Trump was the president, he did make mention of the fact that the elections were stolen. So yes, the US has its own form of democracy, but that's why I think if Africa wants to practice democracy, just like my colleague said, if they want to copy and paste what the US is doing, of course, they've got to copy and paste what the US is doing. But what I think would be beneficial for Africa is to have its own form of democracy, which works best for the people, that works best for the environment. It is not a one-size-fits-all kind of government. My concern is when things go wrong, we seem to bring out this idea that democracy is the best form of government, as it is, without actually understanding that the leadership and institutions that we do have lack elements of accountability, efficiency, reliability, and justice. So I think it's very important for Africans to understand that we must not pick and choose when it comes to system of governance. I believe that what we're experiencing in terms of military coups, again, democracy is one aspect, but another aspect is how it is practiced, which is quite important. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, look at the countries where military coups have happened. Of course, about 50 of the 54 African countries have experienced one form of coup or another from the 1960s and 70s up until today. But what has been the underlying elements? It has been about leadership and institutions, the management of the economy, insecurity, corruption. And these are very key elements, of a proper democratic system. So we've got to, work within our means. We should not pretend that we're trying to defend a system of governance when that system itself is ill-practiced, when that system itself is broken in the African continent. So that's why I blame ECOWAS and the African Union, the UN, when they talk about the fact that democracy has been trumped in the continent. I think it's simple, as my colleague said, we are not practicing what we preach. We are not prescribing democracy as a medication, for the diseases that we have. So there is no reason why we should pretend in one form or the other that democracy is the best system of governance in Africa at this point in time. It could be, but at this point in time, it's not.
Well, let's take a moment because we're still talking security. Let's bring it home. The Nigerian military has vowed to avenge the death of soldiers killed while on a rescue mission in Niger State, here in Nigeria, not Niger Republic. A mass burial has been held for the soldiers at the National Cemetery in Abuja. Chief of Defense Staff Christopher Musa says there will be no hiding place for their killers and people who continue to terrorize Nigeria. Omar Bazoye was there.
With those gun salutes, Nigeria's military bids farewell to 20 of its fallen soldiers, including the Defense Headquarters Special Force Commanding Officer, Major S.A. Oni. Oni, a brave soldier by all accounts, has led his troop in many battles against bandits and terrorists, Nigeria's #1 enemies in the hard-hit north of the country. Today, Oni and his troop have left the stage, taking a final bow with their boots and berets full of pride and gratitude from a country they died protecting in the line of duty. But it is a sacrifice that has left loved ones in torturing grief as they watch the bodies lowered in final farewell, witnessed by Nigeria's top military brass. Some of the gallant soldiers were said to have been on casualty evacuation mission in Niger State when their helicopter was said to have been fired down by gunmen, killing everyone on board. The Chief of Defense Staff says their death is not in vain. Others laid to rest were among those killed in earlier attacks by deadly bandits in Niger State, which has become the epic center of conflicts with terrorists and bandits in the badly troubled north of Nigeria.
In the midst of this tragedy, we must remember that their sacrifice was not in vain, These brave men and women laid down their lives so that we may live in peace and security. They fought on the front lines, battling against the forces of evil and ensuring that the flame of hope and liberty continue to burn bright in our nation. To the bandits, terrorists, and perpetrators of violence who seek to sow division and fear among our people, know this: our resolve will not waver. We will hunt you down, we will bring you to justice, and we will restore peace and security to every corner of our nation. Your actions may cause pain and suffering, but they will never extinguish the spirit of unity and resilience that burns within us.
President Bola Tinubu had in June asked his service chiefs to end insecurity in Nigeria. The attack on these fallen soldiers is the first major onslaught by bandits and terrorists since Tinubu assumed office in May. For the Chief of Defense Staff, the upset is not going to demoralize his officers and men in the military.
As we lay our fallen heroes to rest today, let us remember that their legacy lives in each and every one of us. Let us carry their spirit of bravery and selflessness in our hearts as we go about our daily lives. Let us be inspired by their example to stand up against injustice, to protect the weak, and to strive for a better future for our nation.
As Nigeria mourns the death of its gallant soldiers who have paid the supreme price in the defense of their country, the soldiers are mourned even more by their colleagues who are still in service, but they will be missed the most by their loved ones, many of them too hard to console at a time of national grief. Omo Baswai, Arise News.
Well, David Otto, Bish, Johnson, not a good story there. But again, if you stretch this into what we're dealing with, and you talk about the Niger Republic and Nigeria partnership in the fight against insurgency, with what's happening now, is there a likelihood that there's a pause in that partnership in the fight against banditry, insurgency?
This is the commanders. I'm just watching that video right now, and as a former commander, this is the commander's worst nightmare, is to have your soldiers in cascade. Because what are you going to tell their family? As a commander, it's your responsibility to not just only send them out, but to ensure that they return to base safely. So this is a worst nightmare of any commander. And my condolences to the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and my condolences to the families of these deceased members. And I wish that we ordinary citizens, we are worthy of this supreme sacrifice that this the finest of Nigerians have paid on our behalf. Now, coming down to what you said, I've always believed, and there's empirical evidence to that, that our neighbors have been very, very pivotal in our fight against insurgency and terrorism. You've seen that with the Joint Military Task Force that will allow us to collaborate with each other and even pursue terrorists into the territory of each other. But if we don't service or maintain that relationship, and we allow that relationship to go sour and become hostile, we may end up with a situation which will be a very, very bad situation. It will be like a situation that you had in Iraq when the Taliban was harboring Al-Qaeda. So the worst thing that will happen to us is to have a situation where either it's Boko Haram or ISIS finds a safe haven in a state, in a country that protects them. It means that at any point in time, they can come in from Niger Republic, launch attacks on Nigerian territory, and then they will retreat and go back into Niger Republic, and they will be protected by the Nigerian authority. And we don't want that to happen. We want to continue to collaborate with them. I know the West is pushing, do this, do that. They're not pushing for our own interests. They're pushing for their own interests. And we should avoid joining that bandwagon of not looking, deep down into what is going on and just going with the flow because somebody else wants us to do that. There's no Ecowas without Nigeria. Ecowas is Nigeria. Nigeria is Ecowas. You've seen what is going on in our own country. Our soldiers are stretched far thin. They are almost in every state of this country because there is barely any state in Nigeria without one kind of security issue or the other. So I think that we're better off using our resources, both human and material, to deal with the challenges that we have in our own country first. Because you can only be an effective global leader if your home base is rock solid. The reason why US is able to project power to any part of the world is because they have very strong economy, right? It's a $20 trillion economy. It's not a monoproduct dependent economy. A lot of people don't know that the US is the #1 producer of crude oil. America produces over 14 million barrels of crude oil per day. More than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia produces about 12 million barrels. But because their economy is so large that they consume everything they produce and then import more. People don't know that they do that. But their economy is not dependent on crude oil. The economy is multi-dimensional. They have everything going for them. So for us to be able to project and power within our sub-region and assume and take that leadership position in our sub-region, we have to come back home and build ourselves economically. Because there's no military might without economic might. And sometimes you can't get economic might without military might, so they go hand in hand. So we have to come home and do this thing, build our economy, build our security apparatus, whether it's the military, the police, the civil defense, all of them, and be able to deal with these security challenges that we have at home. When we don't that, we are putting ourselves in the right footing to be able to deal with all the other crises outside Nigeria.
Captain Bish, now you're talking about building blocks. It reminds us of what's happening across the world. There is NATO, and that's what Ukraine, everyone is fighting to be. You need a block to be more powerful, economically, politically speaking. And the BRICS, you spoke about that earlier on, just ended in Johannesburg. And the little that Nigeria has with Niger in the fight against insurgency and terrorism is being threatened.
Yes.
Speak to us more about this.
I think let me also join the captain in expressing my deepest condolence to these are soldiers, but they're human beings as well. Anyone who has been in an aircraft will know the agony that they've gone through. The agony that their families have gone through, the cost to the nation, but it's all about talking again on the issue of military aviation security. And I believe that we have a chief of defense staff, we have the chief of the air staff, and we have other military personnel, chief of defense staff. They have to look at this very carefully and come up with a proper assessment in terms of the vulnerabilities that we have within our security architecture, and try to measure the threats that we have, because these are two fundamental things which every country must have, not just as national indexes, but from each region. You do not deploy your forces if you don't have a proper threat assessment and a proper vulnerability assessment in terms of what you do in the event of a particular incident. I think that has to be very critical. Coming back to your point in terms of where we are with talking about BRICS or the kind of vulnerabilities that we're experiencing in the country, multiple. And Nigeria is at a point in its history that we have a president who talks about renewed hope. Hopefully, we're looking at a renewed hope, and we're looking at a renewed national security strategy on how to defend the various threats that we have. We shouldn't be looking at adding to those threats. Every national security is based on internal and external threats. You manage your internal threats. It gives you the capacity to deal with your external threats. When you combine, elements of internal threats, and in addition to perhaps Nigeria going into Ecowas, to invade Niger. I mean, I use that word because that's the right word. I know ECOWAS says it's not invasion, it's intervention, but there's no difference. To go and invade Niger, on the basis of restoring democracy, will be an additional national security threat. Because as I mentioned from day one, we don't know how Niger Republic is going to react. They may also decide to throw bombs in Abuja. They may also decide to throw bombs in neighboring states or any ECOWAS member state. We don't know that. So we don't have a national intelligence estimate in terms of how these threats will react. So I think it's important that going forward, we have a new government, we have new service chiefs. They have to be able to advise based on not just supporting the regime, but ensuring that the national security interest of Nigeria and Nigerians, but also of Africa, is secured. Because if Nigeria falls into a trap, whether be it from internal or external pressures, then the entire continent is going to collapse. We don't want that to happen. And we have a president who seems to listen to the voice of the people. And I think it's high time that he does listen to not just the internal threats that Nigeria faces, but the external threats that we might face if we go into Niger.
Now we're winding down. Let's come back to you, Bish Johnson. What more do we expect to get from the ECOWAS leaders? Now we're talking about the presidents. The president of ECOWAS has spoken. We saw him, Traore, but again, it comes back to the African leaders. Everyone is spoken, and they've seen the threat. You've assessed how badly this will look if we go the route of military action. What else do we expect to see from them in the days to come? President Tinubu has said that the traditional and religious leaders can go back to Nigeria and talk more.
Sure. I think we're going to see more of diplomacy and the political solution. They're already speaking in that language. Nobody's talking about restoring Mohamed Bazoum, because that may not happen again. They're talking about restoring constitutional order. So what may happen is that the junta will give a timeline by which they will have to restore constitutional order in Niger. I understand they've already done that, but they gave 3 years, which ECOWAS rejected, and rightly so, because 3 years is too long. I don't know what they will be doing in power for that 3 years. And so what I expect is, because when you want to go into negotiation, you want to start from a very far distance, so that eventually you will get to where you want to be. So what I think may happen is that you're going to get to a middle point that may be acceptable to the junta and acceptable to ECOWAS. That is a timeline during which there will be restoration of constitutional order. But there's another thing I want to say. You see, democracy is democracy. There is no African democracy or Western democracy. There are those fundamentals of democracy that must be there. If those fundamentals are not there, it is not democracy. You have to call it something else. You have to have an independent judiciary, independent legislature, full separation of power. You have to have fair, free, transparent election in which the will of the people must count. If you don't have that, then you are not practicing democracy. You have to find another name and give to it. So don't call it democracy, call it something else. So this insecurity we are seeing, it's all linked to bad governance.
Okay, let me quickly bring in David so that we can wrap up now. David, quickly here, if we can do this. And he's raised a very important point that the ECOWAS leaders should at least pick and choose. For now, Bazoum can't be reinstated. And at least they should start talking about the longevity of restoration of constitutional powers, which the junta has raised.
I agree totally. The junta has made it very clear that 3 years, no more. That's a negotiating position. ECOWAS should sit down with the junta and say, why do you need 3 years? Give us an explanation in terms of how you're going to have a transitional government in 3 years. Within that period of time, there will be room for ECOWAS to chop that down, perhaps to 1 year or 18 months. We've seen the same being afforded to Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, we don't know if the junta is going to respect that, which is quite important, and that's one of ECOWAS's fear. But I think, at this point in time, a date has been given in terms of 3 years, transitional period. ECOWAS should go and say, we need less time. Give the reasons why you need more time, and then we give you the reasons why you need less time. But it's important that in actually having a time frame, ECOWAS should consider what it takes for a transitional government to be established for the interest of Nigerians and not for any interest of anyone else. So I think this is where ECOWAS has a job to do, to understand the dynamics within Niger and to make sure that whatever time is agreed upon is sufficient. We don't want to give them less time, and it's not enough. That will not produce a democratic process, which ECOWAS is looking for.
Well, for the interest of the people, for the interest of the continent, I think it's a fine place for us to leave it tonight, because we don't want no more wars amongst people of Africa, Ethiopia, Tigray, Sudan, and now nothing about this region. I'd like to thank you for your time. David Otto, Captain Bish Johnson, many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for the program tonight and for the week. Do join us again next week. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, it's goodbye and thanks for watching.